Somewhere in the outer arm of the galaxy, on a station built from the fused hulls of 100 conquered warships, a single wooden stick was about to break 17 years of scientific certainty, and nobody in the room saw it coming. The Coalition Interspecies Military Academy did not exist to teach cadets how to fight. It existed to teach them how to understand force, the kind of understanding that separated a soldier from a weapon and a weapon from a myth. Species from 11 star systems sent their brightest here. The Dravith, with their crystalline war fans, the Core Something, whose bio-forged claws could cut through starship plating, the Ashen Collective, who fought with sound itself, weaponized into a scream that could liquefy bone. And then there was Earth, a species barely a century into interstellar contact, still regarded by most of the Coalition as gifted amateurs, clever with machines, embarrassingly primitive with everything else. Every cadet, regardless of homeworld, faced the same final trial before graduation, the alloy panel test. A single sheet of Coalition-grade hull alloy, the same material that armored capital ships against plasma bombardment, was mounted at the center of the testing hall. Cadets were handed one traditional weapon from their homeworld, nothing modern, nothing enhanced, and given exactly one attempt to pierce it. Not damage it, not scorch it, pierce it. For 17 years, no one had. The current record, a shallow, centimeter-deep scar, had been carved not by muscle, but by a plasma-edged ceremonial blade wielded by a Corps champion whose name was still spoken with reverence in the Academy halls. Since that day, hundreds of cadets had tried and failed. The alloy simply did not yield. It was engineered generation after generation, specifically to resist puncture, to absorb and disperse whatever force was thrown at it until the force simply gave up. This year's test day arrived with the usual ceremony, rows of alien cadets in polished armor, instructors observing with clipboards of light, and a low murmur of species who had never once considered that today might be different. Then Instructor Vale, a broad-shouldered veteran with scars from 3 separate wars, called a final name on the roster, Cadet Orin Holt. Human. A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the hall. Human cadets were rare at this level. Most washed out early, unable to match the raw physical output of species built by tougher evolutionary pressure. Orin stepped forward. Average height, unremarkable build. Calm eyes. An attendant carried out his assigned weapon on a ceremonial tray, and the room's amusement cracked open into outright laughter. It was a spear, hand-carved, wooden, the kind of tool a hunter might have used 10,000 years before any human had seen a starship. Cadets from 3 different worlds openly laughed. A Dravith officer said, loud enough to carry, that the Academy might as well hand a human a twig and save the ceremony. Even some of the instructors exchanged a look. Not cruel, exactly, but the look people give when they already know how something is going to end. Orin didn't argue. He didn't even flinch. He walked forward, picked up the spear, and turned it slowly in his hands, testing its balance the way his grandfather had taught him to test everything before trusting it with his life. What none of them knew, what not even Instructor Vale suspected, was that Orin Holt was about to make a discovery so simple and so old that it would embarrass every piece of advanced technology in that room. Because somewhere in his memory, beneath the laughter, beneath the doubt, a voice from his childhood was already guiding his hands. And in exactly 90 seconds, that voice was going to break the Academy's most sacred record. The laughter hadn't stopped. If anything, it was getting louder. But Orin Holt wasn't in the room anymore. Not really. He was somewhere years and thousands of light years away, standing in a quiet backyard as an old man pressed a spear into his hands for the very first time. It's not about how strong you are, Orin, his grandfather had told him. It's about how small a point you can make the whole world push through. At the time, it had sounded like nothing more than a grandfather's riddle. Now, standing in front of an alloy panel that had defeated plasma blades and bio-forged claws alike, it sounded like the only thing that mattered. Orin ran his thumb along the spear's tip, hand sharpened, not by machine, by hours of patient, repetitive work, the same technique passed down through generations of his family long before anyone alive had heard the words coalition or alloy panel. It wasn't decoration. It was engineering, just of a kind nobody in this room had been trained to respect. Instructor Vale approached him, not unkindly. Cadet, are you certain you understand the assignment? The test measures understanding of force, not tradition. Sentimental weapons will not be graded more gently. I understand the assignment, Orin said quietly. I've understood it since I was 7 years old. That earned another round of laughter, sharper this time, tinged with mockery instead of simple disbelief. A Dravic cadet muttered something about human cultural relics being put on display for pity points. An Ashen cadet didn't bother lowering her voice at all. This would be the shortest attempt in Academy history. Orin let it wash over him. He'd heard worse. Every human cadet who made it this far had. What none of them understood, what Orin had learned the hard way, through years of being underestimated on a dozen different training worlds, was that dismissal was a gift. It meant nobody was paying attention to how he moved. Nobody was studying his stance. Nobody suspected that the primitive technique in his hands was the product of a physical principle older than every piece of alloy metallurgy on that panel. He closed his eyes for a single second and pictured the technique exactly as his grandfather had shown him. Not brute force, not a blindfold body swing, but a rotational chain. Hips first, then torso, then shoulder, then arm, each segment adding velocity to the last, until every joule of energy in his body funneled down through his wrist and into a single microscopic point of wood. It was called, in the oldest tongues of Earth, the spear thrower's turn. Humans had used it to bring down animals 10 times their size, long before anyone understood the physics behind it. Modern science had a name for the same principle: kinetic chain sequencing, concentrating distributed force into a focused, high-pressure point. The coalition alloy, Orin realized as he studied the panel one final time, hadn't been designed to resist a sharp point at all. It had been designed to resist broad impacts, the wide, crushing blows of claws, blades, and energy weapons that spread force across the surface. Nobody had ever tested it against something built to do the opposite: a single point, nearly all the energy, nowhere for the force to escape. Instructor Vale called for silence as the final countdown began. The laughter dimmed into a low, expectant murmur, not because anyone believed Orin would succeed, but because everyone wanted to watch him fail. Orin took his stance. Feet apart, weight low. Grandfather's voice one final time in his memory. Trust the turn, not your arms. He drew the spear back. The entire hall went silent. And in the next instant, Orin Holt's body began to move in a way that no alien cadet in that room had ever seen a human move before. Control coiled, deliberate, like a spring being wound tighter and tighter around a single, inevitable release. Nobody in the Academy's 17-year history had thrown like this. Nobody knew what was about to happen. Time seemed to slow the moment Holt's back foot pivoted. It wasn't fast, not in the way the room expected fast to look. There was no explosive lunge, no desperate war cry, none of the brute theatrics the other cadets had brought to this same spot. Instead, Orin's motion was almost unnervingly calm, his hips rotating first, a slow uncoiling that reminded Instructor Vale, for a strange half-second, of watching a star quietly building toward collapse. The laughter in the room had already started to fade, replaced by something more uncertain. A few cadets exchanged glances. Something about the stillness of Orin's stance didn't match the mockery they'd been enjoying moments earlier. Then his torso followed the hips. Then his shoulder followed the torso. Then his arm, last of all, almost lazily by comparison, followed the shoulder. Every generation of energy, stacking on top of the last. His grandfather's voice echoed one final time. Trust the turn. The spear left his hand. For one suspended, silent heartbeat, it simply flew, faster than anyone expected a hand-thrown weapon to travel, spinning with a tight, precise rotation that kept its point locked forward, unwavering, like it had been fired from something far more advanced than a human arm. And then it struck the alloy. The sound that followed was unlike anything the Academy's testing hall had produced in 17 years. It wasn't the flat, disappointing clang of failure that everyone in the room had grown used to. It wasn't the hiss of a plasma blade dissipating harmlessly across the surface. It was a sharp, resonant crack, the unmistakable sound of something giving way. For a full 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the instructors, veterans of 100 demonstrations, simply stared. Then Instructor Vale stepped forward, scanner already raised, and the number that appeared on the display made the room's dead silence somehow deepen further. 3.1 millimeters. Not a scorch mark, not an indentation. A puncture, clean through the outer layer of Coalition hull alloy, material rated to withstand direct plasma bombardment from Starship-grade weaponry. Breached by a piece of hand-carved wood, the Academy's 17-year record, held by a plasma blade wielded by one of the most celebrated warriors in Coalition history, had just been shattered by a species most of the room had walked in ready to pity. The laughter that had filled the hall only moments earlier was gone, replaced by something the Academy had rarely seen from its cadets. Stunned, disbelieving silence. A Dravith officer who had mocked Orin loudest just minutes before was staring at the panel like it had personally betrayed him. The ashen cadet who had promised the shortest attempt in Academy history hadn't said a single word since the spear struck. Instructor Vale turned slowly toward Orin, scanner still in hand, expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something closer to awe. "Cadet Holt," he said, voice unusually quiet for a man used to commanding hundreds of soldiers at once. "Explain to me exactly what you just did, because by every principle this Academy has taught for 17 years, that shouldn't have been possible." Orin looked at the trembling spear still lodged in the panel, then back at the instructor. "It's not new," he said simply. "It's just old enough that everyone forgot to test it." Vale opened his mouth to respond, and then stopped, because the number on the scanner had just updated again, cross-referencing against something in the Academy's historical database, and what it revealed was about to change everything the room believed about primitive technology. The scanner's second reading hit the display with a soft chime, and Instructor Vale's expression shifted from disbelief into something far more serious. The Coalition alloy hadn't just been pierced. According to the Academy's own engineering records, it had been pierced in a way the material's original designers had explicitly claimed was impossible. Vale turned to address the stun hall, projecting the panel specifications onto display for every cadet to see. "This alloy," he said, "was engineered 3 centuries ago by the Dravith Metallurgical Guild, specifically to resist distributed force, impact spread across the surface. Claws, blades, blunt energy discharge. Every weapon in this room, mine included, was built on that same assumption. That force, applied broadly, is what breaks materials." He gestured toward the spear still embedded in the panel. "Cadet Holt didn't apply broad force. He didn't even come close to matching the raw output of a plasma blade. What he did was something none of you were trained to consider. He took every joule of energy his body could generate, and instead of spreading it across the surface, he concentrated the entirety of it onto a single microscopic point." A murmur spread through the hall. Not laughter this time, but something closer to dawning comprehension. "In simple terms," Vale continued, "pressure is force divided by area. Reduce the area enough, and even modest force becomes overwhelming pressure. This alloy was never designed to withstand that, because for 300 years, nobody building weapons for this coalition thought to ask the question." He looked directly at Orin. "Humans asked that question a very long time ago, long before metallurgy, long before energy weapons. Thousands of years before your species understood why it worked, your ancestors had already discovered the physics behind it, through nothing more than trial, instinct, and generations of passed-down technique." The room, which minutes earlier had been laughing at a twig, now sat in absolute silence, staring at the wooden spear as if seeing for the first time. A young corps cadet, one of the loudest to laugh earlier, raised a hand hesitantly. "Instructor, if the principle is that simple, why has no one else ever tried it?" Vale's answer was blunt. "Because every species in this coalition designs weapons around power. More energy, more speed, more force. It never occurred to anyone to design around precision instead. Cadet Holt's spear has less kinetic energy than almost any weapon that has ever been tested against this panel, and yet it outperformed every one of them." He turned back to Orin, and for the first time, something like genuine respect entered his voice. "Where did you learn this technique?" Orin hesitated only a moment before answering. "My grandfather. He learned it from his mother. She learned it from hers. It's not written down anywhere important. No journals, no textbooks. Just passed hand to hand, generation to generation, because it worked long before anyone needed to explain why." The admission landed harder than anyone expected. Here was a species of coalition that spent decades quietly underestimating, dismissing their traditions as primitive nostalgia. And it turned out those traditions had encoded a physical principle sophisticated enough to embarrass 3 centuries of advanced engineering. Instructor Vale studied the panel one final time, then looked out at the stunned rows of cadets, Dravith, Ashen, and every other species that had laughed only minutes before. 17 years, he said slowly. This academy believed it had found the limits of what a handheld weapon could achieve. Today, a cadet holding the least advanced weapon in this building proved that we were asking the wrong question the entire time. He paused, and the silence in the room grew heavier still, which raises an uncomfortable point for every one of us. If a technique this old, this simple, could go unnoticed for centuries, what else has this coalition dismissed, simply because it didn't come wrapped in enough technology to look impressive? Nobody in the hall had an answer, but Orin Holt was about to give one, because Instructor Vale wasn't finished with him yet. The question hung in the air only a moment before Instructor Vale turned back to Orin with a request nobody in the hall expected. Cadet Holt demonstrated again, slowly. Every cadet in this room is going to learn exactly how you did that. If Orin felt any satisfaction at the reversal, he didn't show it. He simply nodded, retrieved a second training spear from the equipment rack, and stepped back into position. This time with every eye in the hall locked onto his every movement instead of dismissing it. It starts in the feet, he said, adjusting his stance. Not the arm. Most people think throwing is an arm motion. It isn't. The arm is the last part of the chain, not the source of the power. He rotated his hips slowly, exaggerating the motion for the room to see. Everything starts here. The rotation generates speed. That speed transfers upward into the torso, then the shoulder, then finally the arm, and each stage adds to the speed of the one before it, instead of replacing it. He walked them through it piece by piece. The low center of gravity, the timing of the release, the precise angle of the wrist that kept the spear's point traveling perfectly straight instead of tumbling off target. It was less a spectacle now and more a lesson, patient, methodical, exactly the way his grandfather had once taught him in a quiet backyard, half a galaxy away from anyone who could have imagined where it would eventually lead. The same cadets who had openly mocked him only minutes earlier were now leaning forward, some scribbling notes onto light slates, others simply staring in open fascination. The Dravith officer who joked about twigs was now asking detailed questions about hip rotation angles. The Ashen cadet who predicted his failure was quietly recording the entire demonstration for later study. Instructor Vale watched the sudden reversal with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something more troubled. When Orin finished, Vale addressed the room directly. "Understand what just happened here," he said. "This technique required no advanced materials, no energy source, no technology of any kind beyond a sharpened piece of wood, and a body that knew how to move correctly, and it outperformed every weapons academy has tested for 17 years. He let that settle before continuing. We have spent decades building an alliance around the assumption that technological sophistication is the measure of capability. Today, a single demonstration challenged that assumption at its foundation. Mastery is not always about what tools you're given. Sometimes, it's about how deeply you understand the physical laws underneath them, laws that don't care how advanced your civilization looks on paper. A corps instructor near the back of the hall, a veteran who had trained cadets for over a decade, asked a question many in the room were clearly thinking. "Instructor Vale, are you suggesting we formally study this? A human hunting technique in a coalition military curriculum?" Vale didn't hesitate. "I'm not suggesting it. I'm recommending it, effective immediately, to Academy Command." The announcement sent a fresh ripple through the hall. Not laughter this time, but something closer to reluctant respect mixed with genuine excitement. For the first time in the Academy's history, an ancient human tradition was being considered not as a cultural curiosity, but as legitimate military doctrine, worthy of study alongside the most advanced technology in the galaxy. Orin stood quietly at the center of it all, spear still in hand, watching cadets who had laughed at him minutes earlier now compete for the chance to ask him questions. But even as the room buzzed with newfound respect, one detail nagged at Instructor Vale, a detail he hadn't yet said aloud. If a technique this simple, hidden in plain sight for thousands of years, had gone completely unnoticed by an alliance of 11 advanced species, What else might Earth's primitive traditions be quietly capable of? And more importantly, what would the wider coalition think once word today reached beyond these walls? Word of what happened in the testing hall didn't stay contained for long. By the following morning, footage of Orin Holt's throw had circulated through every barracks, mess hall, and officers' lounge across the Academy station. By the end of the week, it had reached beyond the Academy entirely, passed along Starship networks, discussing coalition training facilities on 3 different worlds, debated by engineers who had spent careers designing weapons around the same flawed assumption Instructor Vale had identified, that raw power, not precision, was the ultimate measure of force. Instructor Vale's recommendation moved through Academy Command faster than anyone expected. Within a month, human kinetic chain techniques was formally added as a supplementary module in the Academy's combat physics curriculum, not as a novelty, not as a cultural footnote, but as a legitimate area of applied study, sitting alongside energy weapon theory and advanced material science. For Orin, the change was strange to adjust to. He hadn't set out to prove anything about his species. He'd simply trusted a technique his grandfather had trusted, that his grandfather's mother had trusted before him, a piece of inherited knowledge that had quietly outlived empires, technological revolutions, and thousands of years of human history, waiting patiently for someone to test it against the right kind of impossible. The cadets who had laughed the loudest became, in an odd twist, some of his most dedicated students. The Dravith officer who joked about twigs spent weeks studying hip rotation mechanics with genuine intensity. The Ashen cadet who'd promised the shortest attempt in Academy history ended up publishing one of the first formal papers analyzing the physics behind concentrated force weaponry, citing Orin's demonstration directly. Instructor Vale, for his part, made sure the lesson extended beyond a single technique. In his closing address to that year's graduating class, he returned to a moment that had briefly humbled an entire alliance of advanced civilizations. "We build our confidence on what we can measure," he told them. Energy output, material strength, processing power. And every one of those measurements is useful, right up until the moment they convince us we've already learned everything worth learning. He gestured to the same alloy panel, now permanently displayed with a small marker noting the exact depth of Orin's puncture, 3.1 millimeters, the number that ended a 17-year record and, in its own quiet way, ended a great deal of quiet condescension along with it. A species we dismiss as primitive, Vale said, solved a problem 3 centuries of advanced engineering never thought to ask. Not because they had better technology, because they understood something older and more fundamental than technology, and they never stopped passing it down. By graduation, the wooden spear itself had been mounted in the Academy's Central Hall, displayed not as a curiosity, but as a symbol, placed deliberately alongside plasma blades, crystalline warfan, and bioforged claws, the most advanced weapons a coalition had ever produced. A small plaque beneath it read simply, "Mastery is not measured by the weapon. It is measured by the understanding behind it." Orin Holt went on to graduate near the top of his class, but it wasn't the grades that followed him afterward. It was a reputation, the quiet acknowledgement, spreading slowly across a dozen worlds, that Earth's primitive traditions deserved a second look. And somewhere light years from the Academy, in a quiet backyard back on Earth, an old man with a smile to know that a simple lesson taught to a grandson, "Trust the turn, not your arms," had ended up rewriting a small but permanent piece of galactic history.